Massive $3.1 trillion. That is the cost Europeans would have to pay for fueling the war in Ukraine for all these years. For past 3 years, Europeans blindly kept poking Russia, pumping weapons into Ukraine in the quest to unseat President Putin. 3 years down the line, they have the Russian economy more powerful than ever and Ukraine in shambles. Because of EU's pro war policies, Ukraine today is totally destroyed. And here comes Trump's masterstroke. Trump just announced Europe will have to bear the cost of Ukraine's rebuilding. No Russian money, no American money, but the EU's money. The EU will have to pay $3.1 trillion over the next decade if it aims to support Ukraine while also strengthening its own militaries amid reduced US assistance. This follows recent signals from Washington about potential funding cuts for Ukraine. Trump has also threatened to cut US contributions to NATO unless European members increase their defense spending from 2% to 5% of GDP. At a NATO meeting in Brussels, US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth issued these warnings. He stressed that European nations must take on the primary responsibility for Ukraine's security and defense. The US, he said, will no longer prioritize European security and will instead focus on securing their own borders. Well, it makes sense. Now let's understand the breakup of the cost. Following Hegseth's speech, Bloomberg economists estimated the potential costs for Europe. Number one, rebuilding Ukraine's military. Around $175 billion over the next 10 years, depending on how the war ends. You see, Trump is directly penalizing EU for supporting Ukraine here. Number two, peacekeeping force. About $30 billion for a 40,000 strong force, in line with reports that peacekeepers may be deployed as part of a future settlement with Russia. Number three, reconstruction. That is where the hefty sum goes. Roughly $230 billion will be required to rebuild Ukraine's damaged infrastructure. Who is responsible for that damage? Of course, it is the EU and US deep state. By luring Ukraine into NATO trap, into NATO dream, they fueled this war and in that process got Ukraine razed to the ground. But that is not all for EU. The largest expense for them would be for improving the military apparatus of EU member states. This includes building up artillery stockpiles, enhancing air defenses, securing eastern borders, and expanding the European defense industry. The main question here is, can they afford it? Can EU afford these massive expenses? Despite Trump's calls for a 5% defense spending target, European NATO members are viewing this as unrealistic. Instead, they are discussing increasing the aggregate defense budget to about 3.5% of the GDP. There are estimates that this would cost the five largest European NATO members an additional $2.7 trillion over the next decade. Mobilizing resources, both economic and military, on this massive scale would be difficult for EU nations. Governments would likely need to restructure their budgets and agree on joint debt issuance. Sectors such as healthcare, education, and welfare would suffer the most from these financial pressures. But that is how EU is going to pay for its misadventures in Ukraine. For past years, EU and US deep state kept mulling over the idea of using Russian frozen assets to rebuild Ukraine. Policymakers in EU were of the view that the $300 billion of frozen Russian assets will be forfeited and handed over to Ukraine. Joe Biden was in full support of this idea, but the Trump administration has junked the plan altogether. As they say, hard times make hard men strong men. Trump is piling up miseries on Europe today, but it will only help them, the EU nations, become independent, strong, and practical in long run. Make Europe great again.